Я не хочу, чтобы эти ублюдки из Варшавского договора бесчинствовали на границах России. НАТО мертво. Мы должны уничтожить Балтийский альянс, пока не поздно. Я не хочу.
81-year-old Vladimir Putin said in February 2034. In May of that year, the first Russian columns began to push through the Baltic defensive line. 4 years have now passed since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. The days when Western societies followed every twist of this war with bated breath are long gone. Today the fighting is largely positional, the front has stabilized, and the Russian-Ukrainian war has become part of a new normal, still present but no longer dominant in European media or political debate. It is easy to understand why fear of the Russian threat has faded. The world's second army, which was supposed to seize Kyiv in 72 hours, became trapped in a grinding war of attrition. Russian power, invoked for generations as a nightmare hanging over Europe, began to look like a myth. Or at least that is how the prevailing narrative now frames it. But is that really true? The past few years have taught a different lesson. Russia, though weaker than many believed before 2022, has also proved far more resilient than expected. It did not collapse under sanctions. It did not break under battlefield losses. Even episodes like Prigozhin's mutiny did not push it into internal chaos. Instead, after failing in the opening phase of the war, Russia regrouped, adapted its methods, and remains convinced it can still break Ukrainian resistance. At the same time, the international environment is becoming increasingly fluid. Transatlantic relations are under strain. Western unity, once taken for granted, is now in question. America, at least rhetorically, is stepping back from its role as the world's policeman. And if it's focused on any great power rivalry, it is above all one with China. And Russia? In the eyes of some American leaders, Russia is not a true rival at all, but rather a reversible card, something that can still be played against China. For the Kremlin, those are highly encouraging signals. Over the next few years, they could point to a broader shift in the international balance of power in Russia's favor. None of this determines the outcome of the war in Ukraine, but it does create room for scenarios that, not long ago, would have seemed far-fetched. The Russian threat is very real, and it would come knocking at Europe's door sooner than many expect. Of course, let's keep in mind the baseline assumptions presented in this piece are intentionally tilted in Russia's favor, because only under those conditions does the prospect of a military operation in Europe become plausible. But the fact that such a scenario is, at present, unlikely rather than impossible is precisely why it deserves serious thought, if only as preparation for the worst-case scenario. That is why today we want to propose a game, a war game. What conditions would have to emerge for Russia to once again become a direct military threat to Europe? Could it seize the Baltic states? Launch an invasion of Sweden's Gotland? Cut through the Suwałki Gap? We are not saying this will happen, but it is worth asking, what if? 4 years of war, a stabilized front, Western unity under question, and America increasingly focused on its rivalry with China at the expense of its engagement in Europe. Uncertainty on this scale doesn't stay in the news. Sooner or later, it hits the markets. I have been trying to respond to these shifts deliberately for years, rather than wait to be caught off guard, which is exactly why I use XTB, the partner of this channel, and a place where I manage my own investments. The platform gives me access to over 8,800 stocks and ETFs from around the world, including companies in the energy, industrial, and technology sectors. And as long as my monthly turnover doesn't exceed 100,000 euros, I buy stocks and ETFs on XTB completely commission-free, then 0.2% commission applies. Remember that investing always involves risk. Our story begins in the winter of 2027. The war in Ukraine is still raging. Despite heavy losses in men and equipment, Russia's armed forces have not lost their offensive capacity and continue slowly but steadily to capture more ground. A few weeks ago, the battle for Słowiańsk began, the last major city in Donbas, not yet under Russian control. As the units of the 8th Guards Army tighten the ring around Słowiańsk, events of equal importance are unfolding in Moscow. Throughout the winter, the Kremlin hosts a series of secret meetings between Vladimir Putin and his closest circle. At these late-night sessions are some of the most powerful figures in the Russian state. Chief of the General Staff Valery Gerasimov, Defense Minister Andrei Belousov, Foreign Intelligence Chief Sergei Naryshkin, and FSB Director Alexander Bortnikov. Their purpose is to assess the strategic position of the Russian Federation, not only on the battlefield, but on the wider international stage. The picture that emerges from these discussions is deeply complex. Although Russia continues to make slow gains in Ukraine, General Valery Gerasimov and the General Staff see little chance of a full collapse of Ukraine's defensive lines. Russia still retains the ability to carry out offensive operations, but the pace of territorial advance is not accelerating. Foreign intelligence brings Putin more encouraging news. Sergei Naryshkin argues that the international climate is tilting in Russia's favor. Relations between President Donald Trump's administration, the European Union, and Ukraine remain strained. In Washington's view, the failure of peace talks is due largely to Kyiv and the EU, which continue to encourage Ukraine to resist and refuse a settlement on terms shaped by Moscow and Washington. At the same time, relations between the United States and Russia remain unusually warm. The Trump administration does not see Russia as a threat to America. In its view, Russia is a threat only to Europe, and Europe should deal with that threat on its own, using European means and resources, without American involvement. Washington is focused on the Western Hemisphere and on China, and it is through these two priorities that it now sees its relationship with Moscow. To the Russians' own surprise, Washington still clings to the illusion that it may be able to flip Russia and use it in its broader contest with China. As a result, the United States is no longer acting as a neutral mediator in the Russia-Ukraine war. It is tilting toward Moscow and appears ready to pressure Kyiv into accepting a series of concessions in Russia's favor. Vladimir Putin remains determined to subjugate all of Ukraine. For him, this is an ideological cause, but even he understands that the Russian military and the defense industrial base need breathing room. That leads him to consider a tactical ceasefire, one that would allow Moscow to regroup before the next round of confrontation with Ukraine. Finally, at the meeting on January 27, 2028, Putin informs his inner circle that he made his final decision. Once Donbas is captured, Russia will halt further offensive operations. Instead, as soon as Słowiańsk falls and Donbas is fully, quote, liberated, Moscow will launch a peace initiative. Putin gives the plan a name: Operation Frontier. The logic behind Operation Frontier is simple. Russia needs a break in the fighting. But that tactical pause has to look like a strategic Russian victory. That is why timing is everything. The peace initiative must come from Moscow, not Washington or Kyiv, and it has to follow a major Russian success on the battlefield. Putin therefore issues a directive. Słowiańsk must be taken at all costs before May 10, 2028, so that during the Victory Day celebrations he can unveil a peace initiative from a position of strength. At the same time, he instructs Naryshkin and Bortnikov to intensify disinformation efforts, deepening tensions between the Trump administration, Europe, and Ukraine, while reinforcing the narrative that Ukraine's military situation is becoming catastrophic. For the next 4 months, fierce fighting ranges over Słowiańsk. Ukrainian forces launch several local counterattacks, but they are unable to push the Russians out of the city. Then, on May 5th, the message reaches the Kremlin. Słowiańsk is ours. On May 10th, Moscow stages its annual Victory Day parade, with the capture of Słowiańsk at the center of the entire narrative. When Putin finally steps up to the podium, he declares, quote, "The capture of Słowiańsk means that all of Donbas has now been liberated. The goals of the special military operation has been achieved. Despite all hardships and sacrifice, the Russian people have once again secured victory." And then he continues, "The Russian Federation is ready for an immediate ceasefire and the start of peace negotiations based on this new geopolitical reality." Minutes later, Donald Trump posts on his Truth Social account, quote, "Great Russian leader Vladimir Putin wants peace. Let's make a deal." And a few hours after that, presidential envoy Steve Witkoff is already on a plane to Moscow. In the weeks that follow, he becomes a frequent visitor there, working with Russian officials on the outlines of a future peace settlement. Meanwhile, Kyiv does know how to respond to Putin's offer. Volodymyr Zelensky, now nearing a decade in power, fears it is yet another Kremlin trap. Some European countries, especially in Central and Eastern Europe, urge him to keep fighting. In the end, however, faced with war fatigue inside Ukrainian society and mounting pressure from Washington, Zelensky agrees to join the peace talks. The decision is shaped in part by the ongoing US presidential campaign. According to the polls, the Republican candidate, J.D. Vance, is the favorite, holding a lead of several percentage points over Democrat Gavin Newsom. Given Vance's attitude toward Europe, Kyiv fears that negotiations with a new administration could prove even more difficult than those with Donald Trump's team. And so, after months of negotiations, a Russian-Ukrainian peace summit is held in Washington on October 10, 2028, under the auspices of the Board of Peace. Both Vladimir Putin and Volodymyr Zelensky attend in person. The summit ends with the signing of a ceasefire. Russia retains control of all the territory it has captured up to that point: Crimea, Donbas, and parts of Kherson and Zaporizhia regions. A demilitarized zone 50 kilometers deep is established along the line of contact. Another 50-kilometer demilitarized zone is created along the pre-war border, from Kharkiv to Chernihiv. At the same time, Ukraine is subjected to restrictions on the size of its armed forces and its military equipment. The ceasefire does not settle the question of Ukraine's possible membership in NATO or the European Union. Those issues, along with the future of the occupied territories, are deferred to a final peace agreement to be signed at some undefined point in the future. These are harsh terms for Kyiv, but its negotiating position is weak. Europe's defense industry is still unable to sustain Ukraine on its own. At the same time, new EU financial aid packages for Kyiv face growing resistance from member states that no longer want to continue supporting Ukraine. And so Ukraine struggles to adapt to the post-war reality. The reopening of the borders triggers another wave of emigration to the west. At the same time, the demobilization of thousands of former soldiers, combined with the country's economic troubles, drives up crime, weakens central authority, and fuels sharp social tensions. European investors do arrive and help finance reconstruction, but the rebuilding process is painfully slow and falls far short of expectations. Ukraine remains outside Russia's sphere of influence, but without membership in Western political and military structures, while the shadow of a renewed Russian threat never fully disappears. The Kremlin still believes that over the long term, it may yet bring Ukraine under its control. After 2028, however, Moscow shifts its focus primarily to propaganda and political warfare, trying to build a pro-Russian base inside Ukraine around the narrative that the West betrayed the country. The countries of the European Union are divided over the Ukrainian question. States such as Poland and Romania want to see Ukraine as a buffer against Russia and therefore push for continued transfers of money and military equipment to Kyiv. But that view is far from universal across the Union. For much of Western Europe, the real priority is no longer Ukraine, but the rapidly escalating tensions with the United States. Tensions that grow almost exponentially after J.D. Vance is sworn in as the 48th President of the United States in 2029. In the years that followed, transatlantic relations effectively began to unravel. Some European capitals, especially in Western Europe, start calling for a reset with Moscow, concluding that Europe will have to rely on some form of cooperation with Russia. In Germany, the AfD gains influence and, citing the declining competitiveness of German industry, demands the restoration of Russian gas imports, including the reactivation of the Nord Stream pipelines. This deepens tensions inside both the EU and NATO and gives rise to informal blocs within both institutions, divided by how individual countries position themselves toward Russia, the United States, and China. And so countries such as Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Sweden, Finland, Denmark, Norway, and Romania tighten cooperation within what becomes known as the Baltic Alliance, a security-focused grouping aimed at containing any further Russian expansion westward. The United Kingdom remains loosely aligned with the pact, continuing the Joint Expeditionary Force format and maintaining military deployments in the Baltic states. France is also invited to join the Baltic Alliance, but Paris plays its own game. The French promote the idea of European strategic autonomy, a doctrine based on keeping equal distance from the United States, Russia, and China. Paris thus signals a willingness to extend a French nuclear umbrella over Central and Eastern Europe, but those proposals never materialized and serve mostly as a tool of day-to-day political maneuvering on the continent. As a result, when it comes to Russia, Paris ends up much closer to Berlin than to Warsaw or London. After the ceasefire, Russia carries out only a partial demobilization and keeps its economy on a wartime footing. The absolute priority is the rapid rebuilding of Russia's military power. Western intelligence estimates that this will take at least 5 years and possibly much longer, perhaps as many as 10. Vladimir Putin remains president of Russia. By 2029, he is already 77 years old. No one seriously threatens his position, and state propaganda presents him as a new incarnation of Alexander Nevsky, a ruler once again gathering the lands of Rus that broke away from Moscow after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Moscow also tightens its grip on Belarus. The Kremlin is dissatisfied with Alexander Lukashenko's conduct during the war in Ukraine and is pushing to make Minsk even more dependent on Russia. Russian security services begin laying the groundwork for the annexation of Belarus after Lukashenko's death. The end of fighting in Ukraine opens a new phase in US-Russian relations, which improve significantly. American sanctions are gradually lifted, and the two countries begin economic cooperation in industry and energy extraction. There is even speculation that through shell companies, American capital is being invested in occupied parts of Ukraine, though Washington officially denies it. The United States continues trying to pull off a reverse Nixon, turning Russia against China. Russian-Chinese relations do in fact begin to cool somewhat. With sanctions lifted, Moscow tries to reduce its dependence on Beijing. At the same time, competition between Russia and China for influence in Central Asia begins to accelerate. Russia does not break with China, nor does it align with the United States. But the tensions are visible, and inside the Kremlin, different long-term scenarios are now openly discussed. China, for its part, does not see Russia as a threat, and views any scenario of flipping Russia as unrealistic. That is especially true because US-China relations also enter a period of partial détente. Two factors help make that possible. Beijing does not escalate over Taiwan, while the United States, working with TSMC, expands its own semiconductor industry on the West Coast. China tries to persuade Washington that it will accept American dominance in the Western Hemisphere, if the United States, in turn, accepts the peaceful absorption of Taiwan by PRC. But J.D. Vance remains skeptical of this idea. Economic rivalry with China continues, yet war with China still appears to be a distant prospect. In January 2034, the Kremlin convenes a meeting in exactly the same lineup as 6 years earlier, when Vladimir Putin informed his inner circle of his decision to wind down the fighting in Ukraine. Once again, around the table sit Gerasimov, Belousov, Naryshkin and Bortnikov. The purpose is to assess the strategic situation in Europe. The first item on the agenda is Ukraine. In the view of Putin and his top officials, there is no need to resume military operations against it. Kyiv is economically exhausted, demographically drained, and politically unstable. Because Ukraine remains outside both the EU and NATO, Russian intelligence services are able to manipulate Ukrainian public opinion, pushing the narrative of Western betrayal and building up a pro-Russian political base centered around the Mir Party, which, according to polling, has a real chance of becoming the second largest force in parliament. The Kremlin believes that this alone is enough to neutralize the Ukrainian problem and creates a path toward bringing Kyiv under political control over the longer term. Despite the limited gains achieved through the war in Ukraine, Russia remains committed to its broader regional ambitions and to the demands it presented to the United States back in 2021, before the war began. In practice, that means seeking to pull the entire post-Soviet space into Russia's sphere of influence. Russia no longer sees NATO as its main threat. In Moscow's view, the alliance is in a state of internal decay. Over the past few years, the Americans have reduced their military presence in Europe, leaving only skeletal forces in the countries of old NATO, as well as in Poland and Romania. Those two states have taken a distinctly pro-American course in foreign policy, buying US weapons on a large scale, criticizing proposals for deeper EU integration, and maintaining close personal ties with President J.D. Vance. From Russia's perspective, the main threat in 2034 is no longer NATO, but the Baltic Alliance, a bloc made up of countries with strongly anti-Russian publics and governments. Individually, these states do not appear especially dangerous, but together they command enough economic and military weight to block Russia's path toward fulfilling its 2021 demands. What worries Moscow most is that even as NATO itself sinks deeper into crisis, the countries of the Baltic Alliance continue to intensify their political, economic, and military cooperation. By 2034, the combined GDP PPP of the Baltic Alliance exceeds Russia's. The bloc is carrying out a large-scale fortification on its borders with Russia, while at the same time expanding and modernizing the armed forces of its member states. Russian intelligence assesses that if an armed confrontation with the Baltic Alliance is to happen, it must come before the alliance's rearmament programs are fully completed. After that, the costs of aggression could become too high, and the outcome of war too uncertain. Russian intelligence gives the shrinking window of opportunity a name: Yegorov's window. Putin, now 82 years old, tells those gathered that Russia must use the favorable international conditions to deal with the rising Baltic Alliance before it grows too strong. Quote, "We cannot allow the bastards of the Western Pact to build a new NATO on our doorstep," he says. From the Smolensk Gate to the line of the Vistula lies Russia's sphere of influence. Then he orders the Russian armed forces to begin preparing an invasion plan against the countries of the Baltic Alliance. The military preparations are to be concealed behind Zapad 34, the major exercise scheduled for September 2034. For long months, Russian military planners work through war scenarios against the alliance, running into a series of problems that show just how much the Baltic region has changed since 2022. Before the war in Ukraine, the Baltic states were widely seen by analysts as the part of Europe most exposed to the risk of the Russian aggression. But now, Sweden and Finland's entry into the alliance, combined with the rearmament of the Baltic states and Poland, has made Russia's ambitions far harder to execute. Each member of the Baltic Alliance brings distinct capabilities to the table. Finland and Sweden field substantial naval and air forces. That gives them the ability to pin down Russia's Baltic fleet and provide air support to the ground forces of Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia from the very first hours of the conflict. The Baltic states can also rely on the steadily expanding and modernizing Polish armed forces. By 2034, the Polish military numbers close to 300,000 personnel and is organized into 6 divisions. Russia's room to maneuver is further constrained by the Baltic Defensive Line, a network of fortifications built by Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia along all the most likely axes of a Russian attack. The most heavily fortified areas are both sides of the Suwałki Gap, as well as the regions around Narva, Woru, Rezekne and Daugavpils. In the end, Russian planners draw up several operation variants, ranging from a full-scale invasion to limited military action and more complex hybrid operations. Quick pause, folks. Some of you have told us that you love the show, but don't always have an hour to spare. And fair enough, life is busy and the algorithms don't exactly reward long form either. So we are trying something new. It's called Essence, a separate channel where we take our episodes and strip them down to what actually matters. No long tangents, no rambling for me, just the core story in about 10 minutes. Every new episode will go up there, and there will be recutting some of the older ones too, with updates where the story has moved on. If that sounds useful, please hit subscribe. It genuinely helps us out. The link is in the description. Now back to the story. Operation 1: Icebreaker. This option envisions a full-scale invasion. In theory, Russia has 3 possible directions of attack: the Baltic states, Finland and Poland. But the ideas of striking Finland or Poland are quickly discarded. Russia is looking for a fast victory, achieved at the lowest possible political and military cost. In Poland, however, US forces are still stationed, and the Polish army, expanded to 300,000 troops, poses a serious obstacle to any rapid move on Warsaw. Finland presents a similar problem. Although in peacetime it fields only around 30,000 troops, its highly developed reserve system allows it to mobilize an army of nearly 300,000 in wartime. In the end, Russian planners conclude that despite the very real difficulties now present in the Baltic region, Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia remain the most favorable targets for a full-scale Russian assault, largely because they lack strategic depth. The objective of Icebreaker is to seize all 3 Baltic capitals, Vilnius, Riga and Tallinn. In doing so, Russia would not only extend its control over the Baltic region, but also shatter the Baltic alliance by demonstrating that the bloc has no chance in a direct confrontation with Russia. Before 2022, many wargames assumed that Russia could capture at least 1 Baltic capital in as little as 60 hours. By 2034, that outcome looks far less plausible. The advance of Russian forces would be slowed by the fortifications of the Baltic defensive line. In the worst case, some Russian units could even be stopped altogether. As a result, the Russian General Staff estimates that it would need not 60 hours, but at least 7 days just to reach one of the Baltic capitals. And that is before the problem of urban warfare, especially if the defenders turn a capital into a fortress city and try to hold out until Allied reinforcements arrive. The lack of any path to a quick victory means that from day one, Russia would have to take a series of aggressive steps not only against the Baltic states themselves, but also against their allies, above all Poland and Sweden, in order to prevent them from coming to the Baltic's aid. In practice, that means 2 highly ambitious objectives are added to Russia's target list: sealing off the Suwałki Gap and seizing the island of Gotland. Although Sweden and Finland's entry into NATO and later into the Baltic Alliance strengthened the defense of Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia, it did not solve their core problem: limited strategic depth, and restricted supply chains. Even if the Baltic Alliance dominates at sea, the port infrastructure of Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia could be damaged relatively easily, disrupting the flow of reinforcements by maritime routes. That leaves the Suwałki Gap as the most practical land corridor for moving support into the Baltics. At the same time, it is also an especially vulnerable one, exposed to Russian attack from both Kaliningrad and Belarus. If war breaks out, Russia would try to cut the Suwałki Gap at all costs, in order to prevent the Polish armed forces from coming to Lithuania's aid. At its narrowest point, the Suwałki Gap is only about 65 kilometers wide, but that does not make it easy for Russia to seize. Even setting aside the fortifications of the Baltic defensive line on both sides of the corridor, Russia lacks favorable starting positions for an offensive in this area. The main axis of the Suwałki region runs north-south, not east-west. In theory, the easiest way to block the corridor would be to capture the city of Suwałki on the Polish side of the border. But an attack on Suwałki would be a logistical nightmare. Russian groupings from both Kaliningrad and Belarus would have to push through forests and marshland. And there is also the political risk. Despite America's growing isolationism, US troops are still stationed in Poland. A strike on the Lithuanian side of the border would be easier. The terrain there is also heavily wooded, but mainly from the Belarusian direction. From the west the ground opens up, and there is a good road connection running from Kaliningrad toward Mariupol. The problem is that capturing Mariupol alone would not be enough to fully shut the Suwałki Gap on the Lithuanian side. The Russians would also have to take Alytus, a city shielded from Belarus by the Nieman River and dense forests. As a result, a full closure of the Suwałki Gap appears unachievable within the first 72 hours of fighting. Even so, a partial shutdown or even the establishment of Russian fire control over the corridor would still pose a major problem for the Polish armed forces. Polish columns moving toward Lithuania would be exposed to Russian strikes, and part of Poland's military would have to be diverted to defend the corridor itself from attacks launched out of Kaliningrad and Belarus. A total or partial blockade of the Suwałki Gap would be especially dangerous for the Baltic Alliance in a worst-case scenario, one in which Russia managed to break through the defenses of Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia quickly and approached one of the Baltic capitals in short order. In that case, the Polish military, which should be moving to relieve a besieged capital, could instead find itself tied down in fighting around the gap. It is also worth remembering, however, that Warsaw would also have escalation options. By 2034, Poland has a highly developed missile and artillery force, equipped with HIMARS and Chunmo launchers, as well as K9 and Krab self-propelled howitzers. That gives Poland a unique ability to strike deep into the Russian rear, both in Kaliningrad and in Belarus. The ability to carry the war onto enemy territory should, at least in theory, offer far better prospects for defending the Suwałki Gap than limiting military action to Lithuanian territory alone. In the event of a full-scale invasion of the Baltic states, the key terrain would not be limited to the Suwałki Gap. Gotland, the Swedish island in the middle of the Baltic Sea, would also be of central importance. If Russia were able to seize Gotland, it could deploy anti-access systems there and severely complicate the Baltic Alliance's air and naval operations. In that case, the Baltic Sea would no longer function as an internal lake for Allied forces. Russian planners devote significant attention to Gotland, but they are hardly alone in recognizing its strategic value. Even before the war in Ukraine began, Sweden had started reinforcing the island's garrison, including by reactivating the Gotland Regiment, equipped with Leopard 2 tanks and CV-90 infantry fighting vehicles. Since then, the Swedish presence on the island has steadily grown. By 2034, the local garrison numbers nearly 4,000 troops, and the island is protected by Patriot and Iris-T air defense systems. Even under assumptions favorable to Russia, namely that Russian forces could manage to penetrate the island, full control over Gotland appears highly unlikely, if not impossible. And yet, an attack on Gotland, like a move against the Suwałki Gap, remains an operational necessity. Russia would need to tie down Poland and Sweden in combat in order to buy as much time as possible to deal with Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. A Russian assault on the Baltic states would almost certainly be multidimensional, much like the attack on Ukraine. The main axis of advance would most likely follow the region's key road networks. One can imagine the attack on Lithuania unfolding from two directions, from Kaliningrad toward Mariupol, and from Belarus toward Lida and Ashmiani toward Vilnius. The thrust into Latvia would likely run through Daugavpils and Rezekne, aiming to reach Jekabpils and then Riga, effectively cutting the country in two. The attack on Estonia, meanwhile, would come through Narva and Voru. It also should be assumed that in an effort to create greater chaos in the defenders' ranks and reduce the value of the Baltic defensive line, Russia would launch a series of bold amphibious and airborne assaults, trying to seize ports and airfields. At the same time, the invasion would likely be accompanied by a broad hybrid campaign targeting critical infrastructure, including undersea power and telecommunications cables on the floor of the Baltic Sea. In addition, Russia would almost certainly try to exploit the Russian-speaking populations in the Baltic states. These communities could be used to recruit saboteurs and agents of disruption, while the Kremlin could also invoke the quote protection of Russian speakers as a pretext and political justification for its aggression. The success of any full-scale Russian attack would depend above all on preserving the element of surprise. Russia would try to conceal its war preparations behind the cover of Zapad 34, much as it used military exercises to mask its real intentions before the invasion of Ukraine. The buildup of troops and equipment would almost certainly not go unnoticed by the countries of the Baltic Alliance. The real question is whether heightened Russian activity would be correctly understood for what it is: preparation for war. That question is crucial. If Russia loses the element of surprise, its chances of successfully overrunning the Baltic states fall sharply. The alliance would need time to mobilize its military resources. That is especially true for Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, whose armed forces remain relatively small and would need to call up reservists in order to fully man the fortifications of the Baltic defensive line. From the alliance's perspective, it would also be highly advantageous to reinforce the Baltic states with allied contingents and expand local stockpiles of weapons and fuel, so that units deployed there could keep fighting even if the Suwałki Gap were cut. Everything depends not only on recognizing Russian intentions early, but also on the political will of the alliance's member states. Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia would almost certainly take the most alarmist view and would need very little persuading to begin mobilization. Poland, on the other hand, might be more hesitant. Finland and Sweden could prove even more cautious. The United States could play a decisive role in identifying Russia's true intentions early. In 2022, thanks to satellite imagery and intelligence networks, Washington had a clear picture of what the Kremlin was planning. It is reasonable to assume that by 2034, the United States would once again quickly determine Russia's real objective. The question is whether an America led by J.D. Vance would share that information with Europe. Given our assumption that a limited US military presence still remains in Poland and Romania, the most likely outcome is that American intelligence would be passed on to Europe, or at the very least to Warsaw. In a scenario involving a full-scale Russian invasion of the Baltic states, NATO would likely play no major role. As noted earlier, this scenario assumes that by 2034, NATO has become a dysfunctional organization, deeply weakened not only by the rift between the United States and Europe, but also by the conflicting interests of individual European states. Germany, for example, under an AfD-led government, would have little appetite for helping defend the eastern flank and would portray the Baltic Alliance itself as an aggressive, provocative project directed against Russia. Even amid deep divisions inside NATO, it is still reasonable to assume that the United States would maintain some limited military presence in Europe, including on the eastern flank. In this scenario, we assume that several hundred American troops remain stationed in both Poland and Romania. In the event of a full-scale Russian assault, the US forces based in Poland would play two essential roles. First, they would constrain Russia's operational freedom. Moscow would want to keep the United States out of the war, and for that reason would most likely avoid pushing deep into Polish territory. Even a move to block the Suwałki Gap would likely be carried out mainly on the Lithuanian side of the border, all to avoid provoking the Americans. But in a different way, the US military presence could also constrain Poland's own room for action. Washington might pressure Warsaw not to strike targets in Kaliningrad or Belarus, fearing that such attacks could trigger a Russian nuclear response. And if Poland defied that pressure, it could risk a complete withdrawal of American forces from its territory. Russian planners ran 100 iterations on a wargame built around Icebreaker, a full-scale invasion of the Baltic states. But the results are disappointing. In 75% of cases, the operation ends in strategic failure for Russia. That does not mean the plan is impossible. But it does mean that conditions for success are exceptionally narrow and depend on several factors aligning at once. Above all, Russian success depends on concealing the true purpose of the forces being assembled in Kaliningrad, Belarus, and along the borders with Latvia and Estonia. If the Baltic Alliance fails to declare even a partial mobilization and Russia preserves the element of surprise, Moscow's chances improve significantly. But even in those cases, Russian planners run into serious constraints. After 100 iterations of Icebreaker, the simulations show that while the chance of reaching one of the Baltic capitals within the first 7 days of war stands at roughly 45%, the probability of actually capturing Vilnius, Riga or Tallinn within the same timeframe is only about 20%. Even the capture of Vilnius, less than 30 kilometers from the border, proves a major challenge. The Lithuanian capital is approached from the east through heavily forested terrain, forcing Russian columns to move along the one favorable route in the area, the Ashimany-Vilnius axis, making them an easy target for Lithuanian defenders. Russian maneuver options around the city are further constrained by the Neris River, which cuts through Vilnius, and by the surrounding woodland. Although Vilnius lies less than 30 kilometers from the border, Russian simulations show that advancing from Belarus and securing favorable assault positions typically takes until day 5 to day 9 of the war. Columns coming from Kaliningrad with around 150 kilometers to cover take even longer. In many cases, they are held up east of Mariupol, where they run into Polish forces moving to support the defense of Vilnius or Lithuanian strongpoints tied into the Baltic defensive line. The wargames also give Russian planners equally important insights into the fight over the Suwałki Gap. In most scenarios, Russia succeeds in establishing fire control over the corridor within the first 72 hours of war. The Suwałki, Mariupol and Augustów-Altius roads become death corridors, inflicting heavy losses on Polish units trying to reach Lithuania. But physically sealing the gap with ground forces proves far more difficult and does not always succeed in Russian simulations. While the thrust from Kaliningrad is often able to seize Mariupol, the offensive from Belarus usually bogs down in the dense forests of eastern Lithuania, further cut up by the Neman River. The Russians also identify another major problem: Poland's missile forces. If the Polish armed forces launched a concentrated missile barrage against Kaliningrad and western Belarus, Russia's chances of physically cutting the Suwałki Gap would fall sharply. So would its ability to maintain fire control over the corridor. In the end, Warsaw's response emerges as one of the decisive variables in the success or failure of Russia's entire war plan. Of all the operational objectives in Icebreaker, Gotland produced the most consistent results. In the overwhelming majority of simulations, Russian attempts to seize the island ended in failure. A strong Swedish garrison combined with local air and naval superiority meant that Russia had virtually no chance of achieving surprise there. Any movement by Russian landing forces out of Baltic was detected almost immediately by the forces of the Baltic Alliance. Even when Russian troops managed to reach the island, their supply lines were cut by Swedish submarines, and the landing force was quickly destroyed by the local garrison. The only scenario in which Russia achieved even limited success on Gotland involved a massive missile strike on the island's military installations, combined with an airborne and amphibious assault that used civilian vessels to disguise Russian preparations. But even in that case, Russian forces had great difficulty maintaining even partial control of the island. After studying the Gotland question, Russian planners concluded that an attack on the island could at best create confusion in Swedish ranks and divert Stockholm's attention away from events in the Baltic states. It would not result in lasting Russian control. In the end, the conclusions drawn from 100 iterations of Icebreaker were fairly bleak. In most cases, during the first 7 days of war, Russian forces failed to capture any of the Baltic capitals. As Polish, Swedish and Finnish forces gradually entered the fight, the Russian advance slowed significantly, and the conflict shifted toward positional warfare. Russian planners concluded that the success of Icebreaker depended above all on launching the war under conditions of total surprise, and on a passive response from Warsaw. The chances of capturing the Baltic states rose almost exponentially in scenarios where Poland chose not to come to the aid of Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia. But how could Russia secure Polish passivity? Russian planners identified several possible paths. The first option would be to pull Washington into the equation. By 2034, Europe is deeply at odds with the United States, but Warsaw itself still maintains close ties with the J.D. Vance administration, and several hundred American troops remain stationed in Poland. That US-Polish alliance, the cornerstone of Poland's security, could also become a potential instrument of pressure in Moscow's hands. If Washington concluded that Poland's entry into a Baltic conflict ran against American interests, because it risked, for example, a Russian nuclear strike or the United States being drawn into war, then the Vance administration could actively restrain Warsaw from coming to the aid of Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia. Russian diplomacy and intelligence could lay the groundwork for such a scenario in the months before the war, arguing that rising tensions between Russia and the Baltic states amount to a local dispute, one that does not directly concern either Poland or the United States, and that any Polish strike on Kaliningrad or Belarus would be treated by Moscow as a casus belli requiring a nuclear response. In this scenario, a Washington determined at all costs to avoid escalation with Russia would, in effect, become the main guarantor of Poland's passivity. A second way to keep Poland on the sidelines would be through a hybrid operation. For years, the FSB and GRU have been building networks of agents of influence, saboteurs and provocateurs inside Poland. One need only look at the growing number of Russian operations uncovered on Polish territory between 2022 and 2025. Russian planners considered the possibility of launching a series of coordinated attacks on Poland's critical infrastructure, power plants, rail hubs, fuel depots, just before or in the opening hours of an assault on the Baltic states. The goal would not be to paralyze Poland permanently, but to create decision-making chaos and force the government in Warsaw to focus on its own backyard rather than Lithuania. Such an operation would have another effect as well. Polish public opinion, seeing attacks on its own territory, might become less willing to support a government sending troops abroad. Finally, Russian plans also include what is referred to as the Suwałki Agreement. This could stand alone or complement the hybrid scenario. In the opening hours of the conflict, Moscow could present Warsaw with a diplomatic offer, one that would also be made public. Russia would not attack Polish territory, would not violate the Polish side of the Suwałki Gap, and would offer a treaty on mutual security. In return, Moscow would expect Warsaw to remain neutral toward the special Russian military operation underway in the Baltic states. The fact that Polish territory had not been attacked would provide political ammunition for opponents of Polish intervention, and there would be no shortage of them in the Polish parliament. Washington, too, could use such a Russian offer to reinforce pressure on Poland to stay neutral. But Russian efforts to guarantee Polish passivity would most likely fail, and Warsaw would ultimately enter the war. For centuries, Poland has repeatedly had to confront the threat coming from Russia. Any narrative about a possible accommodation with Moscow would therefore most likely be seen for what it is, yet another Russian deception. Even so, a combination of 2 or 3 of the tools described above could still blunt the Polish response, for example by preventing strikes on Kaliningrad and Belarus, or by delaying Poland's reaction long enough to make the opening phases of Icebreaker feasible. Because in the end, the key to victory in a Baltic war would not lie on the battlefields of Lithuania, Latvia or Estonia at all. It would lie in the Polish parliament and in the White House. In this case, skillful politics could achieve far more than armored thrust. Option 2. Variant Fog. Shaped by the lessons of the war in Ukraine and by the disappointing results of the Icebreaker simulations, some Russian strategists conclude that Moscow should abandon the idea of a full-scale war with the Baltic Alliance and instead lean into a hybrid option, the same model that worked well in Crimea and Donbas. Russian planners give this hybrid strike scenario against the Baltic states the codename Fog. Fog is built around several stages and escalation thresholds, to be activated depending on how the situation develops. At the lowest end is disinformation. At the highest is the appearance of the so-called Little Green Man in one of the Baltic states. The scenario begins with a large-scale Russian disinformation campaign, tailored differently across the countries of the Baltic Alliance to fit local conditions. In the Nordic countries, the emphasis is on budget pressures. Swedish and Finnish social media are flooded with material highlighting the supposedly astronomical costs of maintaining the alliance, backed by manipulated data and false calculations. The message is simple: this is not our war. Let the Poles and the Baltics take care of their own security. In Poland, the operation takes on a different tone. Russian disinformation works on 2 fronts. On one side, it amplifies Eurosceptic and pro-Russian narratives, pointing to the supposed benefits of normalizing relations with Moscow. After all, this is the course already taken by Western countries such as France, Germany, and the United States. On the other, Moscow tries to weaken Polish-Lithuanian ties by exploiting historical resentments over the Vilnius region and the rights of Poles in Lithuania. In the Baltic states, the campaign again looks different. Here the main focus is the Russian minority. Russian-speaking communities, especially in Estonia and Latvia, become the target of an intense influence operation. Russian media, operating through informal channels, push the narrative of systemic discrimination and cultural threat. At the same time, the FSB recruits agents among local activists, organizing seemingly spontaneous protests and provocations. The goal is straightforward: force the Baltic states to deal with internal tensions instead of preparing for defense. Once the disinformation campaign begins to bear fruit, the divisions become visible and Russian narratives begin to enter mainstream public debate. Moscow reaches for the next tool: sabotage of critical infrastructure. Ships operating under false flags would systematically damage undersea telecommunications and power cables on the floor of the Baltic Sea. At the same time, cyber attacks would target the government and military infrastructure of the alliance states. All of these actions would remain below the threshold of war, and attributing them to Russia would be difficult. Gradually, the Russians would move on to more important targets. Key bridges and railway junctions along reinforcement routes from Poland to the Baltic states would be blown up. Explosions would strike ports in Klaipėda, Riga and Tallinn. Then, once the ground had been prepared, Russia could move to the highest escalation threshold, within the fog, the deployment of little green men. As in Crimea and Donbas, Moscow could use the presence of Russian minorities in the Baltic states as the pretext for such an operation. The most likely places to activate this scenario would be Narva in Estonia or Daugavpils in Latvia. In Narva, roughly 95% of residents are Russian or Russian-speaking. In Daugavpils, the figure is about 55%. Narva is especially vulnerable because it sits directly on the Russian border. Working through FSB networks and recruited locals, Russian services could stage a Crimean-style scenario in Narva with considerable skill. It might begin with the alleged beating of Russian-speaking activists, followed by attacks on local police units, demonstrations, and street unrest. Footage of such events would be carefully recorded and amplified by Russian media and diplomacy. The accompanying narrative would focus on the persecution of Estonia's Russian minority and the world's indifference to their suffering. Those events would then serve as the pretext for proclaiming a Narva People's Republic, whose authorities would appeal to Moscow for protection. That alone would be enough for Vladimir Putin to announce an armed intervention. Within hours, Russian troops would cross the border and enter Narva. Their move would be supported by Russian sabotage and diversionary teams that Moscow had quietly inserted into the city in the weeks before the crisis. Russia's objective in Estonia would be limited. It would not aim to seize the whole country, only Narva itself. Once in control of the city, Moscow would declare that Narva now falls under the Russian nuclear umbrella and demand immediate negotiations over the protection of the Russian minority in the rest of the Baltic states. From the standpoint of the Baltic Alliance, fog is the worst possible scenario. Russian actions would unfold in the grey zone and would be interpreted differently across the alliance. Latvia, even if it stopped short of calling this a formal war, would likely still demand that its allies launch an anti-terror operations and remove Russian forces from Narva by force. Other members of the alliance, however, might take a more cautious view and look for a diplomatic way out. Although fog may appear more favorable to Russia, it comes with a number of serious risks. Above all, preparing the ground for a Russian operation in Narva would take many months, and the members of the Baltic Alliance would not necessarily remain passive throughout. The alliance could respond with hybrid measures of its own, especially in Belarus, and it could also conclude that Russia's actions amount to preparations for war. It seems particularly likely that a rise in Russian intelligence activity in Narva would not go unnoticed, and would trigger stronger protection of key buildings across the city. A reinforced Narva garrison could pose a serious challenge to Russia's little green men, whose success in Crimea depended above all on the fact that Ukraine was completely unprepared for that kind of aggression. If a Russian attempt to seize Narva were to lead to prolonged urban combat lasting more than 72 hours, fog would effectively end in strategic failure. The whole point of the scenario is to secure a rapid victory and confront the Baltic Alliance with a fait accompli. Failure to take Narva quickly, by contrast, would push Russia to the brink of a full-scale war with the alliance. And as the icebreaker simulations suggest, that is not Russia's preferred path. Option 3. Prince Kurbsky. Any serious analysis of a possible confrontation between the Baltic Alliance and Russia has to include all plausible scenarios, not just those that begin with one form or another of Russian aggression. Belarus deserves particular attention. It is, in effect, the only former Soviet republic that Moscow has managed to keep fully inside its sphere of influence. But what if Russian control over Belarus were to begin to crack? That is where option 3, Prince Kurbsky, enters the picture. The name is a reference to the historical figure Prince Andrei Kurbsky, who betrayed Tsar Ivan the Terrible and defected to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. It is March 2034, Russia is preparing for a war with the Baltic Alliance, but first it must deal with a growing crisis in Belarus. Alexander Lukashenko is now 79 years old and seriously ill. The end of his rule is clearly approaching. The Kremlin is fully aware of his condition and is already drawing up succession scenarios. Although Lukashenko became politically dependent on Moscow after the crushing of the 2020 protests, he was never Russia's ideal vassal. He resisted the permanent stationing of Russian military bases on Belarusian soil. He refused to send Belarusian troops into Ukraine when Putin expected him to. For decades, he tried to balance between East and West, preserving what remained of his autonomy. After the war in Ukraine ended, the Kremlin moved to tighten its grip on Belarus, placing loyal figures in key positions across the state and steadily narrowing Lukashenko's room for maneuver. But Putin's inner circle is divided over what Belarus should become after Lukashenko's death. Some argue that Belarus should be annexed outright and absorbed into the Russian Federation as another republic. Others believe that would be unnecessary since Belarus is already under Moscow's de facto control and the formal annexation could trigger anti-Russian unrest. Before the Kremlin reaches a final decision, however, news arrives from Minsk. On March 12, 2034 at 9:37 p.m., Alexander Lukashenko dies of a massive heart attack at his residence in Minsk-Drozdy district. The news reaches the Kremlin first. Belarusian state television reports it only several hours later. Under the Belarusian constitution, power formally passes to Natalia Kachanova, the chair of the upper house of parliament. In reality, however, effective control falls to General Alexander Wolfowicz, secretary of the Security Council, who enjoys the full backing of the Kremlin. After news of Lukashenko's death breaks, spontaneous protests erupt in Minsk and other Belarusian cities, quickly gaining momentum in the days that follow. The demonstrations are fueled not only by hopes for democratization after Lukashenko's death, but also by rumors that Russia is planning to annex Belarus. The Kremlin denies it, but the denials do little to calm the situation. State television portrays the protests as a Western plot, and the security forces are ordered to crush them before they can grow stronger. In Minsk, the OMON riot police side with the government and carry out the order. The streets run with blood. But elsewhere, events unfold very differently. In the cities of western Belarus, mass defections begin with soldiers, police officers, and other security personnel switching sides and joining the protesters. In Brest, the entire local garrison defects, allowing the opposition to take control of the city. The border with Poland is opened, and opposition figures who had until then been living in Poland and the Baltic states begin pouring back into Belarus. In Brest, they proclaim the creation of the Republic of Free Belarus. They promise democratization, call on the police and military to join them, and demand the withdrawal of Russian troops from Belarusian territory. The call from Brest is answered by Grodno, Baranovichi, Lida, and Pinsk. In each of those places, local police and military units also switch sides and declare for Free Belarus. The Kremlin can no longer tolerate this situation. Putin orders the launch of an anti-terrorist operation, declaring that its purpose is to help the legitimate authorities of Belarus, who, he claims, have fallen victim to a Polish-Lithuanian conspiracy. As Russian forces begin pouring into Belarus, the government of Free Belarus appeals to the Baltic Alliance for help and for a humanitarian intervention. At that moment, the decisive game begins. The Baltic Alliance is suddenly faced with a historic opportunity to pull Belarus out of Russia's grip. But do its members have the political will to seize it? The Belarus question would almost certainly divide the alliance. Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia would be the strongest voices calling for recognition of the Free Belarus government and for armed intervention. Driving Russia out of Belarus could secure the alliance's eastern flank and push the Russian threat far away from the Baltic states. Poland, however, might have a harder time taking such a clear-cut position. Some political forces would, no doubt, demand a humanitarian intervention, if not because of the appeal from the government in Brest, then at least in defense of the Polish minority in the Grodno region. Others, however, would warn that Belarus falls under Russia's nuclear umbrella, and that even a limited intervention could spiral into a full-scale war with Moscow. The J.D. Vance administration would almost certainly try to block any such move as well. Finland and Sweden would likely oppose intervention too, seeing Belarus as a distant theater. The problem is that the decision would have to be made quickly. 1 week after Lukashenko's death, Belarus is split in two. The eastern part of the country, together with Minsk, is controlled by General Alexander Wolfowicz, backed by Moscow. The west is held by the government of Free Belarus, which has now moved its seat to Grodno. With each passing day, more Russian units would pour into Belarus, and before long they would begin crushing the rebel-controlled parts of the country. If the Baltic Alliance truly wants to pull Belarus out of Russia's sphere of influence, it would have to intervene immediately. What we have outlined today is one possible picture of a hypothetical armed confrontation between Russia and the Baltic Alliance in 2034. We looked at three paths: a full-scale invasion, a hybrid operation, and a Belarusian succession crisis. In none of these scenarios was a Russian victory assured. That in itself matters. These scenarios show that in a confrontation with Russia, the Baltic Alliance is not doomed to lose, even without any US involvement. Especially not if the threat is met with unity. Lithuanians, Latvians and Estonians standing shoulder to shoulder with Poles, Finns and Swedes. Extrapolating events and trends as far as 8 years into the future is of course burdened with a huge margin of error. That is why it is worth stressing that this is not an attempt to predict the future, but a scenario analysis. In fact, along the way there are plenty of points at which the Russians would lose any realistic chance of even contemplating an offensive war in Europe. Ukraine itself, presented in our scenario from the Kremlin's perspective in an ultra-positive light, remains a key constraining factor. If Kyiv were still driven by anti-Russian resentment, while its socio-economic position remained moderately stable, then any upheaval in Northern Europe could trigger an attempted Ukrainian reconquest on Russia's southern underbelly. That is why an independent Kyiv would almost certainly also work closely with the Baltic Pact, and might even join it. The same applies to America. A trend favorable to the Kremlin may continue, but it may just as easily reverse. On top of that comes Russia's economic and diplomatic recovery. In our scenario, we assume that process unfolds very smoothly for Moscow, but it is obvious that in reality it would be a major challenge, even in the event of a ceasefire. So, to reassure some of you, under current conditions the likelihood of such a scenario materializing is low to very low. However, if such a confrontation were to occur, the scenarios presented today make one thing clear: there is no cost-free way to defeat Russia. It would always require money, lost equipment, and human lives. The alternative, failing into Russia's sphere of influence, is worse still. The war scenario also showed that victory requires more than modern weapons and disciplined armies. It also requires political and societal will. That is especially visible in the dilemma over whether Poland should use its missile forces against Kaliningrad and Belarus. A passive Warsaw could open the door for a Russian takeover of the Baltic states, but a determined Warsaw, willing to carry the war onto Russian-controlled territory, could help defend not only Poland's sovereignty, but that of its allies as well. Of course, one can still cling to the hope that appeasement toward Russia will spur Europe another war, and that Russia will eventually become a civilized member of the European order. But the experience of the past several centuries suggests otherwise. Time and again, Russia has reminded us how relevant the old Latin maxim remains. Si vis pacem para bellum. If you want peace, prepare for war.
Hey guys, it's Barney, the Essence narrator. I'm just here to remind you that you can have all your facts updated in a much shorter format than this. I'm just saying, you know? Essence does exactly that. We tackle all of this info, but we boil it down to just 8 to 10 minutes. Short and sweet. That's how we like it. By the way, Hubert wanted me to tell you that Good Times Bad Times isn't going anywhere. It is here to stay. Essence is just a nice addition. Hope to see you over there.